This week on Lectures in History, Northwestern University professor Ken Alder chronicles the origins of American mass production through gunmaking. He explains how early firearms manufacturing in the 19th century pioneered interchangeable parts and assembly line methods that transformed the nation's industrial economy. More after this.
We're here at the beginning, and one of the things I want you to remember is studying old technologies can seem quaint, but in a way, we're not going to be judging these people about the problems they solved for us, but the problems they solved in their own time. And in doing so, I do think we learned lessons about how technology worked for them and therefore can be thought of for us. They don't know the future. They don't know what's happening. And we're going to go back and look at these old technologies, from the early 19th century and try to take them as seriously as the people at the time took them, which was very seriously indeed. So one of the places to start this lecture is at the end, with Ford's mass production. Now, this is something you're all familiar with. I'm sure in any U.S. history class you've ever taken, Fordism in the early 20th century with his assembly line becomes an integral part of the story. And famously, of course, Ford is an entrepreneur. He's trying to make money, and he's trying to make a lot of money. And in fact, the way he does it is by using machines at every step of the process such that his cars that he's making come out with what are called, I'll explain in a sec what this is, interchangeable parts. Each piece is made so precisely similar to the other pieces of its type that it can be slotted right into the car as it moves along the assembly line in production. And that precision in manufacturing came from somewhere. And the paradox I'm going to show to you today is it did not necessarily come from where you think. It did not come from entrepreneurs or private industry initially. Okay? So Henry Ford is the end result in some respects of the story I'm telling you today, but we're going to look at its origins. There were many objects made prior to Ford's machines that were also like this, with interchangeable parts and mass-produced in some sense of that term. Sewing machines, Remington typewriters, bicycles, and yes, Henry Ford. But what comes before them? What is the first object to be mass-produced? Indeed, the first technology that is designed in some sense by science.
I believe Eli Whitney created interchangeable parts for guns.
Interchangeable parts for guns is the suggested answer, and it is half right. Very good. Half right is good. Half right counts. It is guns. It's not going to be Eli Whitney. Heads up. Eli Whitney is not the inventor of interchangeable part manufacturing, despite what it says in every American history textbook, nor was he the first person to make it practical. He didn't invent it, and he didn't succeed in doing it. And that's going to be part of our story today. But it is guns. This is our artifact of the day, which obviously I did not bring into the classroom for all the right reasons. It's illegal in the state of Illinois, and rightly so in the state of Illinois. This is a Colt 1951 Navy Revolver. And I want to pause for a second here and think about a gun in general, and this gun in particular, before I get into my story. Guns are very charismatic devices. They're powerful. They may deeply upset some people. And of course, for some people, they're a thrill. I know we have members of this class in ROTC who may be very familiar with guns. Others of you may be familiar with guns for other reasons. Some of you have maybe even never touched one or held one. I have a colleague who's held one of these, and he tells me, an original Colt, and he says, it's a beautiful thing in its own way. It's incredibly powerful. This is a very, very powerful device, and I want us to begin by just respecting it as a piece of technology, simple as it is, that we take for granted, that there is something that people have learned how to assemble in a size that a person can carry that can deal out death at that speed and rate and effectiveness. I'm not going to romanticize the gun. There are people who do. I'm not going to particularly talk about how it transformed the American West, a legitimate story. Or, the shootouts at the OK Corral, right, all those sorts of things. I'm a particular fan of things like high noon, sure. I'm not going to treat the gun as a romantic object or even as a charismatic object today. I'm going to treat it as a banal object, something very ordinary and yet a remarkable technical achievement at the same time. Because I'm interested in how these got made, because this is just one gun. But the point is, Colt made thousands upon thousands of such guns. And how he did so and why he did so is the nature of my story today. So we're going to talk about the gun and the Colt revolver and the long history of firearms. We'll talk about the surprising French origins of industrialization in the United States and America. And I will teach the engineers in the class, of which we have quite a few, where did engineering get its start? You will learn today, surprisingly, we're talking about guns. They are the first objects to be scientifically designed and modified to increase the thing that people in the military cared about, which was their deadliness. Okay? So we're going to look at the origins of modern engineering, the very beginnings of engineering, and we'll learn some surprising things about how it got started and transferred to the United States, and then we'll talk about the American system and draw some conclusions. Okay? And here's some of the concepts you'll be learning about American exceptionalism, about the role of the state and the military in industrialization, about the origins of modern engineering, about labor and skill, invention and and reskilling, about technology transfer, and about industrial districts. So some of the concepts, but what I want to remind you is your task in a class like this and in a lecture like this is to think about the concepts, not to take necessarily detailed notes on everything that happened. You're not responsible for those level of detail, but conceptually to think about what is going on in a technology, what makes the technology work in a social context, because that's your assignment. You are being asked in this class, in this sort of flipped classroom modality, to go out and write your own social history of an artifact, right? That's the challenge of the class, is to watch me do it and then go out itself and do it for something you care about. And learning how to do that research and looking for the sort of social context, you'll need skills like these. You'll need to think about, well, where did it come from? What is a technology transfer? You may need to think about, how was it made? Was it made in a singleton factory or as part of some much larger project? Okay? So, the Colt revolver in the long history of guns. So that's what's called an exploded view. I've already talked to you a bit about that. And what it shows you is just how many pieces go into a Colt, right? In the middle of the 19th century. It's not a simple slap together thing. It's a very complicated piece of apparatus. And to some extent, remember, that's sort of one of our methods in this class, is to take the technology apart, to look at the insides, to open it up, and not simply look at technology from the outside socially, but both from the outside and from the inside out. That Colt revolver became famous in its day because it was taken to the world's first World's Fair. So we'll talk about World's Fairs later in the class. There are famous ones in Chicago in the 1890s and then again in the 1930s. But this was the first one. It was called the Crystal Palace exhibit in London in 1851. And like World's Fairs later, it would bring in different nations would have different exhibits of showing their works and wares. And then millions, literally millions of people would come and look through, and there were prizes on offer and the like. And here is the Colt display. Colt brought his revolver, that one, to this show. And he didn't win a prize. He won an honorable mention, but he won something in a way much more important. He won a kind of popular approval and technical approval by people who really mattered in the British government. Remember, this was a moment, right, in which the United States in 1790, as we had learned, 60 years before this, is an agrarian country, right? Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton are debating whether the United States should be industrial at all. And 60 years earlier, there's nothing in the United States in terms of major industry. Colt shows up in 1851 with this kind of remarkable thing, this gun that's made with this new method. And he gives a speech to the British Engineering Society, where he talks about what he had done to make this gun, how he had developed a set of machines to produce each part so precisely and so exactly that they would fit together uniformly, so simple that women and children could do it, operating these self-acting machines. In fact, women and children were not largely involved in the arms industry at any point, though they did do other things that were very important for a war effort. And he said that was especially valuable in the US because their labor costs were high and craftswork was less developed, people were less skilled, and because repairs had to be made often in the field. And if you have, identical parts, you can slap in a replacement, right? We're very used to that today, right? How often do we repair things? We tend to, slap in a new one. Modular production is something we're very used to. He also emphasized something, and I'll come back to this again at the end of the talk, that his repeater, this gun that would shoot multiple rounds, compared with other ones of its type, and they had existed for hundreds of years, people who had purported to create guns that could fire multiple shots. That goes back. Leonardo da Vinci had drawn a picture of a gun that could shoot multiple times. And many people had even created them as demo models. They didn't really work that well. They were extremely expensive and they were rare, but people had heard of them. His worked. His was reliable. His was safe. And that was in thanks part to his precision manufacturing, which I'll explain in a sec. And then he began to say why it was especially valuable again in America. Because, he argued, it was especially suited for a certain kind of border warfare that the United States was then carrying out against native peoples and against, in this case, Mexicans in the Mexican War. And he specifically cited it as a kind of weapon for expanding the borders of the United States against these enemies of civilization or enemies of America. All right, we're going to come back to that. So who did invent this? Was it block printing? This idea, where did it come from? This idea that you could make things with identical parts. Why would you want to do that? To what end? So to some extent, you could tell a story about making things identical that goes back very far. Printing, right? If you think about all the letter A's in a font, right? They're all identical and you slap them into your typewriter. To some extent, you can think of those as identical things, right? You keep on making the letter A over and over again. Obviously, that was a Chinese invention originally with wood blocks for printing. But that doesn't really quite capture what makes interchangeable part manufacturing, because interchangeable part manufacturing, the pieces have to work together. They have to slot together. They have to be exact enough to work together. So people had made wooden clocks with pieces that were essentially, first you make all the, the various gears, and you then just assemble the clock at the end. So that had existed in the 18th century in a few places. But to do it for metal was much harder. And yes, we have Eli Whitney as the possible inventor around 1801 of interchangeable part manufacturing for a complicated device, the gun, which was probably the single most complicated device an American could own in this period. No, he did not invent it, as I said, nor did he achieve it. And what is it? It's a way of thinking about production that is systemic, that thinks about production not as a single making of a device, but analytically breaking it down. It implies a kind of control over the production process that's more than one single person's act. It's an analytical process of breaking it down, right, into multiple steps, treating each distinctly, and then organizing that collectively. And in a way, if it works, it shows that each step has been done right. If it fits, you have managed and controlled the process of manufacturing. Eli Whitney was never able to do that. So now we're going to have to figure out where it comes from. Now, Colt was able to do it, and successfully able to, thanks to his publicity, the British invited him to open a factory in London, which he did. So the great British armaments city is Birmingham, and that's a place that up till then, as I'll show you in a sec, made thousands and thousands of muskets and other weapons. But London is a new place for factory work, and Colt opens a shop there. They also go to a new place in London that the British government is going to control. And they, after sending a committee to the United States of skilled mechanics who travel around various sites in the United States, the Colt's factory and others, and buy American machinery, come back to just outside London in Enfield and retool a new factory to make guns in England with interchangeable parts. And in France, the same thing happens. They hear about the Enfield factory, and they too create, in their old manufacturing town of Saint-Étienne, where guns have been made for hundreds of years, they create a new factory with these new kinds of machine tools. French readoption. There's a clue there about where interchangeable parts manufacturing actually originally comes from, and a sort of mystery that I'll want to solve by the end of the talk today. But these guns have dramatic effect. These new guns, because of their precision manufacturing, because of the way they allow for rifling and the like, proved to be very effective in the first war that's essentially fought with these kinds of rifled instruments, these rifled guns, and that's the Crimean War, which, of course, Crimea is back in the news today, and much of Ukraine is back in the news today, and I think we'll see, without foreseeing the comparison between then and now, ways in which this story of guns and technological development in and around war is one that is an ongoing, continuous sort of part of the story of technological change and the role that war and the military play in that technological change. Obviously, now it's more about drones than it's about guns, but many of the same lessons will apply. And Colt himself, after this huge success in Europe, is able to come back to the United States and set up what's called Coltsville, outside Hartford, Connecticut, where he builds a factory. He'd had prior factories where he had made the gun I showed you earlier, the Navy Revolver. But he opens in 1855, and it's the largest factory in the world at the time, and he's producing close to 150 guns a day. So this is not about a gun. This is about making many guns. Okay. Let me do a little framing now so that you understand a bit about what's at stake in Colt's invention and what he's achieved. So I'm going to tell you sort of a longue durée history of gun production and what makes the difference between a gun and a gun and a gun and a gun. So this is early. These are kind of the earliest American colonists who would have had guns like these, people from England who had come to the New World in the King Philip's War, which was a war in the area of New England between native peoples and English white settlers. This was the standard kind of weapon of choice. It was a pistol, English made. It had a matchlock, meaning you had to light a little flame to get the powder to start up here. And then that fire then was entered into a tiny little hole that shot a ball out where more powder and a ball were packed, and they were loaded through the muzzle. And they're smooth bore. Smooth bore means no rifling. And no rifling means, because of the aerodynamics of a ball, they're wildly inaccurate. These guns are dangerous at short range. They make noise. They're intimidating. But it's not so much clear as you would think that they're superior weapons even to bows and arrows. Now, it depends on circumstances. And in the arsenal of different kinds of tactics, that could be a very powerful weapon. And native peoples wanted them. And they were sold them in number. They're made one by one, artisanally crafted. And there's a reason you want a good craftsman to make this gun. Why? You're holding it in your hand, and you're setting off a massive explosion force, and you want the ball to hurt them and not for it to blow up in your hand, right? That's a serious challenge, right? It is something where these guns, to some extent, their barrels are just beginning to be tested, proofed, as they say. So here's the gun that the American Revolution is largely fought with. Charleville musket. It's not a matchlock, it's a flintlock, which means that this mechanism here doesn't require a fire. It's a flint striking steel that produces a spark that sets off some powder in a little pan, and that through a hole, again, sets off the charge. Okay, they're still smoothbore and they're still muzzle loaded. It takes about 30 seconds if you're skilled to load one of these and fire again. And again, they're smoothbore, but the construction is probably better, so they're a bit more accurate, but 100 yards would be, at the most, something you might be likely to hit. So, which is why, as we'll get to in a sec, the use of these guns in war did not involve people like aiming and shooting so much as people in rows, men in rows, firing all together in volleys on the hopes that at least somebody would be killed on the other side. At this time, it takes 7 times a person's weight in lead to kill them with a musket. So there's a huge logistics challenge too in getting munitions and firing the guns and doing all that. And it's more to create these volleys that will sort of make the other side step back rather than targeting people individually.
C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
Now we're getting to our part of the story, the Colt revolver, right? What is the difference here? It's percussion fired, which means it uses a fulminant, which is a highly sort of very dense kind of explosive material that just with smacked upon starts the fire for sending the bullet out. Instead of being loaded from the muzzle, it's loaded from the breech, which means it doesn't mean you have to jam it in and load it each time. And in fact, it's a revolver, right? So you have 6 chambers ready to go. And it's also rifled, which means it sets a spin to the bullet, and that spin means it's much more accurate because wind resistance and inequalities in the ball are sort of balanced out. And it's made with interchangeable part manufacturing. And that was part of Colt's claim, right? He had figured out a way to make sure that that hole, when the chamber advances that contains the bullet, would align with the barrel very precisely and stay in the right place using a kind of racket mechanism so that it wouldn't explode in your hand or that multiple chambers, wouldn't go off at the same time. In fact, he had trouble with this. It takes him about 20 or 30 years of working with different models to get it right. It's not a one-step process. He gets a patent finally in 1836, but that's only after much testing. And even then, he goes down sometimes to the Capitol, and literally on the steps of the Capitol, he's demonstrating his weapons to Army officers, and often multiple chambers go off. The Army is kind of skeptical about this device, right? And actually, Henry Knox, you'll meet in a bit, who was a guy who was a general during the American Revolution and lost fingers firing a gun. I mean, this is not an unusual occurrence. This is dangerous stuff. So it takes a while to get that to work, but he does have, because of his interchangeable parts, not just better ways of making them, but more precise. You want that metal to be tight for the explosive power to be directed out and not into your hand. Now, this is another big advance. This is a Colt Browning, 45. It's the kind of weapon that became prevalent around the turn of the 20th century, and this particular one was used through much of World War I by American troops. Semi-automatic, meaning now, rather than cocking to get the thing started, it automatically triggers a new, or not triggers, sets in place a new bullet, whatever, simply by using the force of the recoil to advance it. It also works with cartridges. Now, cartridges existed for quite a while in a way, but even the Colt, after you shot your 6 shots, you have to open it up and load each one again with powder and a ball in 1850. Whereas this one, magazine loaded. A new clip of 10, 11, whatever it was, they varied, and you were off firing again. And they were mass produced. And then this, the Persian Gulf War, and something like an AK AR-15. What I want to say is there are a couple things to think about when you think about something like this. there's a deceptive continuity here. They all have triggers, they all have barrels, they all shoot projectiles. They're all designed to kill. They're radically different. In some ways, they require radically different kinds of tactics in war, and they have radically different properties. And something like this, a genealogy like this, can be quite deceptive. And I put them up here in this way, in part to remind you of what looks similar may not be. My question today is going to be, how do we get from here to here? And then a bit beyond it. But in that's the period I'm looking at. This is a period of a rapid technological revolution in the United States. So, gun ownership in the US. So, it was very widespread and uneven. About half of American white colonials had a household, lived in a household with a gun, but they tended not to be military grade or advanced guns at all. They usually were light Fowlers or occasionally a pistol. And regionally, there were big differences in who owned guns and how many of them. Highest in the South, lowest in the Mid-Atlantic, reasonably high in New England. And in each case, there was a reason. In the South, because of the enslaved population, and guns were an important part of controlling slavery and plantations, and also in conflict with native peoples in the South. In New England, there was a long military tradition of militias, so people had guns and had mustered out on many occasions as they battled with native peoples or France and other empires. And it was lowest in the mid-Atlantic colonies, where neither of those situations held. And here is some data that people have done in probate records and inventories of people at death, looking at ownership, and it more or less matches the story I just told you. But you'll notice, for example, in South Carolina, lots of pistols, right? 23%, where it's very low everywhere else. Again, I think that's very much a sign of people using it as a matter of controlling slavery on plantations. And there are no guns that are made in the United States, essentially none. There may be 200 people who have the title of gunsmith in the United colonies at this time, but in fact, they're only repairing guns and assembling them from European parts. And, you know, in a way, this story is why these are very complicated devices to make. They require very fine tooling of machine parts. And this is a tumbler, for example, in this mechanism, and look at the sort of shape that you have to get of that to make it really good, right? It might be something you could repair or make one of, or at absolute need. But to make all the pieces and make them fit together was not easy. In Europe, guns like these took at least 24 different skilled laborers working in very different skills to assemble. And the gun lock itself required about 15 people to work, to make work, right? And each of them doing different tasks. A very high degree of the division of labor in the manufactories. And the gun barrel, the same thing. These are very, very difficult to make things. And in fact, if you look at where the guns therefore came from, because obviously they're not coming from within the United States, these are where gun producers exist in the 18th century. In Birmingham, in Liège, in Saint-Étienne, and in France. It's a little jumpy. And in Spain and Plasencia. These guns are shipped in two directions out of the continent. They're shipped down to Africa as part of the slave trade. And often guns are found in exchanges for enslaved peoples in Africa. And of course, they're also part of how people are enslaved. And of course, they're a great disruptive force in the societies of West Africa and produce a great deal of unrest. Now, African historians argue about whether this gun-slave cycle was the driving force, and it clearly wasn't the sole driving force. It's clearly a huge part of driving force. 300,000 guns a year, 500,000 in some years, half of which coming from Britain, going to West Africa, what are called for the Angola trade, although it means essentially all of West Africa. And guns are sent to the New World. For example, in addition to the sort of standard, typical commercial kinds of guns that are being sold, things like Fowlers for shooting birds and animal, military-grade muskets are rarely sent, except at time of war. And what we just heard about last time, right, was the French and Indian Wars, the 7 Years' War as it's known internationally. the British did ship 60,000 roughly guns to the New World for that purpose. Most of them stayed around. A lot of people walked home with them after the war was over and kept them. And that was a supply of guns, but it wasn't enough. So during the American Revolution, there was a huge need for military guns by the Continental Army. I mean, in fact, the very beginning of the American Revolution is, in a sense, a struggle over the control of weaponry. One of the ways it begins is when a large ship that the Americans have sent to gather gunpowder and saltpeter for making weapons and powering weapons in the continent of the United States is somehow goes missing on the high seas, probably because the British have done something. But then in Lexington and Concord, that famous battle, basically it's a battle over an arms stock that the Americans have assembled from British supplies in Concord. And that's why the British troops go to get it. And of course, famously, right, the Americans are there shooting from behind hedges, using rifles, and using this style of warfare that's supposedly more akin to the kind of style of warfare they'd learned in the Indian Wars. That is, in fact, a kind of false lead. It's true about the battles of Lexington and Concord, but in general, it turns out, as Washington discovers, as the citizens of Boston discover, wars still require masses of men standing in lines, firing muskets. And these are the ways battles get won. And, George Washington is sort of at his wit's end because he has no guns. The local guns people are bringing in from home are no good. And he is eventually turning away recruits in 1777 because he doesn't have enough guns for them. So the Continental Congress authorizes attempts to make guns in the United States. Most of them fail. On short notice, they make a couple thousand guns at most. But the need is for hundreds of thousands. So Benjamin Franklin and Robert Morris are licensed to procure them from abroad, which is exactly what happens. And it's French guns which win the American Revolution. They bring over at least 120, as many as 200,000 weapons. This is a Charleville M1763, which is the classic arm that the American Revolution was fought with. And a lot of it is brought over by this guy, Beaumarchais, better known perhaps as the author of Figaro, the play, and later the opera, and authorized by this man, Charles Vergennes. So Charles Vergennes is essentially the prime minister of France, or the chief minister of France. And at one point early in the early part of sort of 1776, he's approached by the British ambassador to France, who says, I know the Americans are soliciting guns from you. It would be a terrible idea for you to supply them with guns. Why? Well, think about it. If you start to supply them with guns and they rebel, think of all the other people that are going to get guns in the future. All the other colonialists, not just on the North American continent, but what about those Caribbean colonies you prize so highly? What if they got guns? What about if Latin Americans got guns? The only gun supply in the world at scale are in Europe. And the Europeans are not wanting to sell guns to colonials, right? And Vergennes said, you're right. That would be a terrible idea. We would lose our spice islands and we would lose our sugar islands. And he sends off the British ambassador largely satisfied. And of course, he's lying. He's absolutely selling guns to the Americans, first covertly, and then eventually with public subsidies and essentially interest-free loans without collateral. And in fact, in the end, they send soldiers as well. And the soldiers they send in particular are artillery officers with new cannon. And in fact, those cannon played the crucial role in the final defeat of the British in Yorktown. The French Navy has successfully blockaded the port. Cornwallis is trapped on an isthmus at the end. And basically, the French cannon have arrived, and the French are just bombing him and bombing him and bombing him, and he has to surrender. And it really does end conflict on the North American continent. So where did this come to America? So it isn't just that the French helped the Americans with materiel during the war, the Revolutionary War. They also sent something else. They sent an idea. And here, the conveyor of that idea is going to be, of all people, Thomas Jefferson, who's ambassador to France in the 1780s. Now, we've met Thomas Jefferson already as a person reluctant to endorse industrialization, right? Hostile to machinery. But as I noted at the time, there's a bit of a contradiction, one of the many contradictions of Thomas Jefferson. Declaration of Independence and slave owner, for example, but understandable in his own terms. A contradiction and a paradox for us, but in his own way, he thought of himself as a man of science and of the Enlightenment. And he had a fascination with machinery. His polygraph, which copied texts, the design of Monticello. And while he was ambassador to France, he heard about an invention there that was kind of new under the auspices of the artillery of France, and involved making guns with interchangeable parts. So he went to the place it was being done in Vincennes, in the Chateau de Vincennes, on the eastern edges of the city. And there, on the 8th of July, 1785, he witnessed a man, Honoré Blanc, who was the organizer of this manufacture, under the auspices of the artillery, take parts of gun parts, all the tumblers here, all the frizens here, all the pans here, and assemble a gun lock. Picking the pieces randomly, one from each. Interchangeable part manufacturing, in short. And he thought it was kind of amazing. Actually, I should point out that Blanc had just moved in 1785 and was just getting started with his production. And the two previous the occupants of this dungeon had been the Marquis de Sade. He was told he had to leave. And the two things that moved in was a baker who set up a bakery and Honoré Blanc, B-L-N-C, who set up in the dungeon at the bottom with his machines. And here's the kind of pieces he was making. So Thomas Jefferson not only writes about this discovery back home to the United States, he writes to John Jay, the Secretary of State. He writes to Knox, the Secretary of War. He writes to Patrick Henry, the governor of Virginia. And he sends examples back to the United States. What was this invention and how did it come about? In France, not in the United States, and not through Eli Whitney, right? This is something that is a technology transfer. So I'm going to spend a little time here, not too much. This is something I know a lot about. Actually, my first book, academic book, was about this topic, about gun making in France and its transfer to the United States. I wrote the book about 25 years ago and got my job here at Northwestern with it. And it was probably not the obvious kind of topic to write about for an ambitious historian at that time, but it has served me well. I mean, I really have had a great career here at Northwestern, teaching topics like this and sort of expanding on this kind of project, writing about guns and making guns and lie detectors and a few other things as well. So this is a topic I know a great deal about. So I'll try to go quickly and just be summarizing here. But the French artillery was an incredibly innovative force in the 18th century. And the reason was a reform led by this man, Jean-Baptiste Gribeauval, who was the chief inspector of the artillery, and somebody radically redesigned the artillery, thinking about it as a system, not as individual guns, embossed and beautiful and inscribed with ultimo ratio regum, the last argument of the king, but something more austere and machine-turned and made according to very specific calibers so that each gun could fit a ball independent of, balls didn't have to be designed for that particular gun. And they were a very powerful new weapon, but it was more a new concept of how to organize the military. And he did something else. He transformed education for engineers. So artillery engineers are the first people in the world to be trained to be scientists or engineers.
C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
Where do you go in the 18th century to become a scientist or become an engineer? Most people apprenticed or learned on their own. These are the first schools. ever opened for engineering in France to train artillerists and other kinds of engineers. And in fact, guess what? The first textbooks that we have, that you engineers read and everyone else who takes a STEM class reads, with problem sets, you owe it to them. You're welcome, France. And the other thing about them that was very interesting was that they were, remember, artillery officers, like all officers in the French army, would have been noble blood. You'd have to prove you had aristocratic heritage to get in general and to be a French army officer. And there was reasons for that. You'd been trained by your father usually, and there was a sense of a family tradition. You know, they had reasons of justifying that, and it was part of their service. An aristocrat served the nation by serving in the military. They open it up to members of all ranks of society. And they do something else quite genius. They're not just using the math, I'll show you in a sec, to design objects. They're using math, in a sense, to design themselves. That is to say, to pass tests, to be good at those tests, to get in on merit. And it's still the case today. I don't know if you already, I'll get to it in a sec again, is the École Polytechnique, is the successor engineering school of these, founded during the French Revolution. It still has some of the hardest math tests to get in the world, and remains a kind of meritocratic sorting system, well, here too, right? So, education, and then they transform ballistics. So, physics knows that, oh, Aristotle is wrong, but you can do Galilean physics, right? And there's gravity, and you work on first principles, and they fly on what? Parabolas, right, people? No, they don't. Of course not. Not in the real world where there's wind resistance and everything else. These engineers figure out a new way to do knowledge, not working like a physicist from the bottom up, but by measuring the relevant parameters and then looking at ways of matching them mathematically. It's a very new conception and quite different in some ways from physics. Now, they use physical principles, they use Newton's laws, they use the calculus, but they're not trying to build the world all the way up from the bottom. They're approaching the world at the middle and looking for correlations and relationships between parameters. And that's how they start to design better guns that shoot farther. And the mathematics get very tricky. Euler, that's how that's pronounced, does a lot of that early work. And they start to redesign. They develop machinery that tests the muzzle velocity, build such guns as these, right? And then create tables of calculation, because you can't sit there and do the math in your head, but how high to aim the gun for the distance you want. And they turn it into a kind of mathematical exercise to be an artillery officer. And then they do something else. They develop new techniques for representing technological objects. Mechanical drawing is something we owe to them. So this is a rational form of representation, right? Perspective drawing, very old, goes back to the Renaissance. This is new, what's called descriptive geometry. It's not taught anymore, but it's a way of representing objects in 2 dimensions that give you a real sense of their physicality with shadows. And then essentially related to that is orthogonal projection, which is how technical drawing works. It's side views, top views, right? And they're interrelated and scaled correctly, right? And that's now, you know, architects have done versions of this going back many, many, many centuries. This is quite different. This is meant to be to scale and precise. And then they start to set up rules for how to make things, because their job as artillery officers is to superintend the making of guns as well as organize the use of cannon in the field. So the drawings are turned into gauges, go and no gauges. The drawings there are turned into gauges, gauges that allow you to test whether the parts are made correctly and within a tolerance. I mean, I tell you to make something that's, 3 centimeters long, in a way that's meaningless. If I say 3 centimeters plus or minus a millimeter, now I'm telling you, right? Now I'm giving you something you can really do. And if it's plus or minus 2 millimeters, you go, it's easier, right? This is the conceptual apparatus you need for interchangeable part manufacturing. It's not just something you do with machines. You have a whole set of conceptual developments that are necessary. And you then use machines with jigs and gauges to make those parts very precisely. And that's what Blanc is doing in that factory in Vincennes. What's the legacy in France? Well, the Revolutionary Wars. And guess who is the leader of France in this period? An artillery engineer, Napoleon Bonaparte. And here's the accoupler technique again. Okay, part 3. Any questions? So flying through the material today. Yeah, please.
I just had a question. So last week.
No, just pause for a second.
Okay.
Yeah. Go ahead.
We were talking about how Jefferson was so proud of like our farmland and American exceptionalism in that sense. Like, I don't really understand where the pivot was. Was it just like, I'm going to change my mind and I like this design?
It's a good question. I mean, contradictions are hard to sort.
Yeah.
I think he did like the idea of labor-saving devices, even though, of course, he absolutely believed in husbandry as the proper vocation for ordinary people, men especially, and farmers, because it gave them autonomy. Yeah. And reconciling the two is a challenge. I don't deny. It's hard. Just as hard to reconcile all men are created equal in plantation slavery, right? In part, the way there is through a conception of race. In this case, also, I think it's who's using this machinery and at what scale. And I think the fact that it's for the armaments industry may have also, he, like Hamilton, had understood that for America to be at all independent, it needed to have, weapons and production of guns within the continental United States. I mean, he's made other contradictions, right? He's against government doing things like buying Louisiana Purchase until he does it, yeah. Right? Yeah. So, pragmatic as well. Okay. So, technology transfer. I told you about how he sent these gun locks over that had been made by Blanc and sort of wrote to everybody. Is that enough for technology transfer? No. One of the things that's very important about technological change and diffusion is it almost always takes people carrying skills. I mean, I think people in Silicon Valley will tell you the same thing. That's why they have non-compete contracts and they don't like you to move around. Humans embody knowledge and skill. So it wasn't enough to just send over some lock plates. What made interchangeable parts thrive in the United States was, in fact, they imported more than some gun locks or had some French armaments, around. They created the first engineering school in the United States, which was also, yes, the first military academy in the United States, which was West Point. And dig this. In this period, cadets studied mathematics for 3 hours a day, 6 days a week, 43 weeks a year for 4 years. ROTC, you ready for that? That's a lot of math. And the rest of the time they spent on engineering, on drawing, on chemistry and geography, and on French. The first American engineers are military engineers. And they had this book, which was written by a French artillery officer. And it was commissioned by George Washington and written in English. He actually flees the revolution, which is why he's back in the United States after having served in the French Corps during the American Revolution. He returns to the United States in 1794. And he talks about how artillery officers have to produce uniform guns in the United States. And that officers are responsible for making it happen. And so we do finally get to Eli Whitney, who is a contractor who hears from Jefferson about this idea for interchangeable part manufacturing and gets some contracts. But without dissing the man, it's clear that he never really does achieve it. He's constantly behind on his contracts. It never really kind of made to work. I mean, he barely can get the guns out the door. So it's not just to explode the textbook view of Eli Whitney. I mean, he was, even the cotton gin story we tell about Eli Whitney can be opened up and re-examined. But in any case, his gun story, where he was sort of trying to parlay his success with the cotton gin into a new kind of technological achievement, doesn't really pan out. But what does pan out is this. The US government sets up armories. These are national-owned nationally run, staffed by civil servants, filled by workers paid by the US government, who work and make guns in 2 locations. Harper's Ferry in what was then Virginia, now is West Virginia, which you can see in 1803 and then in the 1850s, and where, in a kind of experimental workshop way, artisans, skilled machine tool builders began to build guns with interchangeable parts. And I won't say damn the costs exactly, but kind of close. Nobody is paying attention to price, really. Everyone understands that this is being done for national security purposes, to use a kind of anachronistic term. This is being done to get the United States to a new kind of military power. And there's a John Hall, a very eminent a machine designer, and that's one of the first interchangeable part muskets that's actually made in the Springfield National Armory. Now this one is of course famous, no, excuse me, the Harper's Ferry Armory. The Harper's Ferry Armory is famous, right, because John Brown's raid comes there, right, and of course there are guns there. And then in 1861, there's a tussle over who should control it. In the end, the Union forces end up managing to burn Harper's Ferry because it's located in the South, and it's the only gun production center in the South at the start of the Civil War. The Confederates managed actually to remove most of the machinery, take them to Virginia, and try to set up manufacturing there without much success, it must be said. So where does the South get its guns? From the Enfield production in London. 300,000 guns come from England for the South, using Yankee machine tools and Yankee methods of production. There's a blockade, but those are the guns that largely, in addition to things that were sort of kept in magazines and in armories in the South, were largely what fueled guns for the South during the Civil War. But here's the real heart of the story. This is what happens in Springfield, Massachusetts, where the other armory is founded. Early beginnings, but really in 1794. And that's where the first American guns are made in number. Totally modeled on that old French musket. And in a time, part of not just its own manufacture, which will be important, and as you will see, will produce many guns for the Union during the Civil War, but up and down the Connecticut Valley, right? Colt is down in Hartford. Eli Whitney is over in New Haven. Eli Jr. takes over and has his own factory down there where he collaborates with Colt. And up and down this valley, people are moving in and out of the armory, working on new machine tools, and then taking them into private industry and then back into the government armory. Gun production involved 195 steps, and they're making them mechanized: lock, stock, and barrel. And that's one of the first milling machines anywhere in the world. Its provenance exactly is a bit doubted, but it's certainly from the Connecticut Valley in the 1818, 1820s. These are the kind of gauges, right? Look a lot like Blanc's gauges and the gauges in France. That's an amazing lathe, turning machine really, that can take a model template and copy it, a bit like Thomas Jefferson's copy machine, right? And reproduce in a regular shape of a stock. And then rifle barreling. This is subsidized by the US government at scale. And many of the contracts that go to the private companies are also government contracts, right? Now they're definitely making for the private market as well. It's a both. But government contracts go like this, and the private market goes like that. And the combination, which was true in France as well, is what makes it possible for these companies to innovate and create new things. And it's a long quote, but I think it's worth reading. This is what somebody said when they went to the Springfield Armory. What really made it work? All that machinery, I know, that's what bedazzles people, but this is what made it successful. Nothing can be more admirably planned or more completely or precisely executed than the system of accounts kept at the offices, which not only every pecuniary transaction, but also, as would seem, almost every mechanical operation or act that takes place throughout the establishment is made a matter of record. Thus, everything is checked and regulated. No piece, large or small, can be lost from among its hundreds of fellows without being missed somewhere in some column of figures, and the whole history of every workman's doings and of every piece of work done is to be found recorded. Ask the master armorer any questions whatever about the workings of the establishment, whether relating to the minutest detail or to the most comprehensive and general result, and he takes down a book and shows you the answer in some column or table. Now, remember I said this is sort of the history of the banal? Treating guns as ordinary things, banal objects? That's how manufacturing works too. It's about accounting. It's about keeping track of stuff. It's about representing things exactly. And what does it do? In general, it moves knowledge off the shop floor from the hands of the artisan into a higher level of the organization, into the tool room, into the workshop room, into the drawing room, into the very many different sectors, the bureaucracy, if you like, that makes manufacturing, mass production possible. Mass production is not just a success of entrepreneurs. They play a role. It's not just the success of mechanics, people who make new machine tools and new machines to do things. It is a triumph of bureaucracy, a triumph of keeping track of the minutest detail and organizing it as a system. So now we're going to turn to Colt and get close to wrapping up. It's the largest factory in the world. Mark Twain visits it, and he's staggered by its complexity. And you can see the conditions under which men worked. By and large, there become this division between people who work at the machine, doing the task, following the template, prescribed only one task over and over and regularly again, and those who organize that production, and those who make those machines, right? It produces a whole new industry, a machine tool industry in the Connecticut Valley, and that is what's responsible for creating the possibility of making sewing machines and typewriters. Remington, right? Guns, sewing machines. These kinds of tools are what power the American Industrial Revolution. So this is what firearms trade looked like in the past, and now is what it looks like. In the early 19th century, America becomes an armaments powerhouse, and it sends arms throughout the Western Hemisphere. It transforms the revolutions in Latin America and the Caribbean. So the United States, by government agreement, sends guns to the black rebels in Haiti to overthrow the French. Then it has a change of mind about if that's such a good idea. There's constant change of policies, but they did send guns initially. And then as the other revolutions break out in the 1810s in Latin America, once Spain has been taken by the French, the United States decides not to intervene so directly, but it sells guns or allows guns to be sold by its merchants or not. I mean, think about the situation, the United States is in today vis-a-vis something like Ukraine. Every day in the news, right, we see news about whether or not the United States will or won't permit, or under what terms it will permit, or who will pay for it. That's what's going on here too. It makes the United States the hemispheric power. You could talk about the Monroe Doctrine and talk about diplomacy, but guns matter. This course is committed to the proposition that technology matters. And then the Indian Wars. That's a quote from Colt. I won't read it, but he basically thought of his revolver as particularly suited for Indian Wars, for the cavalry, for multiple shots from a horseback against an adversary. And this very, very famous painting/lithograph and that painting by a native person, Stone Rabbit, demonstrate just how powerful that new technology was. Native peoples had used guns and were skilled at horses, but this was a sense that you had to have the latest gun. You had to always be able to produce new guns. There is a new accelerating sense of how powerful guns are and in number. In the Mexican Wars, they play an incredibly important role. In the American Civil War as well, these are young men, all with their Colt revolvers prominently displayed. And if you look at arms production during the Civil War, you could see something like the Springfield Armory getting very close to mass production, if not mass production, right? Close to 250,000 guns being produced every year at the Springfield Armory. I mean, that is the great advantage that the Union has. And Colt's involved and other arm-making firms. Creates a huge, huge new influx of money and machine tools and power that allow this Connecticut River Valley system of industrial production to basically, after the war, look for other things to make. McCormick Reapers, sewing machines, what have you. Okay? And that's what spurs this new form of mass production in the United States. But its origins lie in a US government-funded effort to make guns. So here's a story you can tell. And it looks like a continuity story. But it's this phase I focused on, and for good reason. You know, well, it's the moment when the logic of capital, that you're basically doing something for return on investment, that you're looking for efficiencies in production, it wasn't that really drove interchangeable part manufacturing. It was an engineering logic, one of making things better and tighter and to spec, partially to control a labor force, and partially because of theory of replacement parts, and partially just because of an aesthetic. They were committed to this as a way of making things. Eventually it did pay off, and they always talked about it possibly having payoff in terms of supplanting labor, but it was still cheaper to make guns by hand in this period. This, though, is in the end, the result. And it has this other advantage, this precision manufacturing. It allows you to make different kinds of guns, right? It allows you to make guns that are so tightly tooled that the explosive power shoots at your enemy and doesn't blow up in your hand, right? So it allows for new kinds of innovations and new kinds of technologies. And that's sort of true of CAD/CAM and 3D printers in the present day, right? This process of making things where the knowledge is removed from the shop floor and now automated, and you can directly go from the computer design to the production. First of all, a lot of that's developed for the military. You're trying to craft a helicopter blade. That's a complicated piece and shape, right? That's one of the first uses of things like CAD/CAM. And then, of course, it eventually gets used in industry years later. Okay, so we've come back full circle to mass production. I guess I wanted to emphasize one thing, that even Ford in his day relied heavily on government contracts to get started in times. I mean, he was definitely successful in selling lots and lots of Ford Model Ts. Any color you want, as long as it's black. He cranked them out with very little respect for the customer, except he wanted something that could be produced cheap enough so that anyone could buy it. He had incredibly high labor turnover, right? This was a very demanding job, so he paid a good wage, $5 a day famously. But this is the end result of a long process. And of course, it continues during wartime to be a source of incredible production. These are Jeeps being cranked out at River Rouge. So, conclusion, manufacturing then and now. So, one of the things we've learned is about technology transfer. It's not enough to just, hey, I've got an idea, use it over there. No, you have to transplant often a whole culture. You have to bring over a whole set of people with skills. It's not something you just plant a seed in the, plant a lock plate in the ground and suddenly you've sprouted out an arms manufacturer. And that remains the case this day when people talk about transferring technology, right? Recently, they're asking new chip manufacturers to repatriate to the United States or patriate to the United States. Guess what? South Koreans are helping do it. You don't just set up a factory, turn on the switch, and it runs, right? It's a complicated social process. It involves culture and knowledge that's very hard to sort of simply write out in an instruction manual. And of course, the military was an incubator. The military industrial research complex, of course, is an anachronistic term. Not until the 60s does Eisenhower, 1961, does he use the term. But there is a sense in which the United States' founding was based on a kind of interrelationship between the military and industry, and between that and a kind of research. at the Ordnance Department, among artillerists and the like. So we've talked a bit about mass production, how it's an ongoing process of skilling and reskilling, that some people lose skills in the sense that they're doing simpler tasks, but other people are gaining new skills, making machine tools and the like. And there's a constant process of that. We'll follow that later. We've looked at manufacturing districts, industrial districts. And then let's close with this. Is there an American style of making things? So I've given you some of the economic reasons why Colt justified the value of interchangeable part manufacturing in the United States. The high cost of labor, lack of craft skills, right? And those may be sufficient to explain why something like mass production or machined production thrived in the United States. Would that make America exceptional? Well, it would make it, a particular set of economic factors. I don't think that's sufficient, though, to explain the rise of this form of industrialization in the United States. I think this form of industrialization in the United States also had something to do with a particular role set by the policy of the US government, a desire for an autonomous nation that had gun capacity, for example, and a particular willingness to enforce labor discipline in its armories, which they did. They put those armorers working in Springfield and Harper's Ferry under military discipline and obliged them to do tasks. Now, they rebelled, they pushed back. There was a lot of labor trouble in both places at times, and we'll talk about the people who worked in this system on another day. But there was a way in which, just as at Ford, early on in the production facilities at places like Harper's Ferry and at Springfield, there was labor discipline enforced. And in a way, that's why it failed in France initially. Isn't that weird that the French invented something that obviously is, quote, the right way to do production, which is mass production? Isn't that the right way? Well, no. The French rejected interchangeable part manufacturing. They had a war to fight, obviously the French Revolutionary Wars. They had the chaos of that time and the need to ramp up production super fast. And they didn't have time to build all the machines and the tools at that period. So they just turned to the traditional methods of production. And in a way, one of the things we learned last time is there are many routes to industrial modernity. The French were really good, in fact, at what we would call today flexible specialization. I gave you the example of Lyon, where they made silk and were very quick and clever about changing the design every year. And what's more, invented the jacquard loom, which was a machine that you could program with wooden punch cards in the year 1800 to redesign entirely how the weave would happen. That's clever. And then you make a lot of money doing that. And it's a style. So different nations, yes, do develop different styles of technology and different styles of production. There's no one right way to do it. The United States in itself also was not simply a country of mass production. It was a country full of small-scale shops that did machine tools and the like. Okay? So that's the lecture for today. Maybe I'll let you ask a question or two so we can wrap up. Anyone? I know I covered a lot of ground. Yeah, please. Wait, we'll give a sec. So, okay. Here, go on. Please.
You're saying how the knowledge was in the hands of the artisans, and then it went to higher levels of the organization. Was that the shift when the laborers were started to be seen as more blue collar and less skilled?
That's right. Yeah, so semi-skilled or even eventually low skilled. I mean, people who make guns in Europe, the artisans who make guns, are incredibly skilled and highly paid and consider themselves labor aristocrats is a kind of term they use. And also, in fact, often themselves function as entrepreneurs in their own right. They were making money off how many they sold. They were not employees. At Colt, they're employees. Colt employs also some of the most skilled machinists. A guy named Root, a bunch of others that are the ones who do all the machine design for him. He doesn't do machine design. So yeah, this is a process of what will eventually result in, at the limit in Ford, where people are basically doing the same task over and over and are not really expected to innovate themselves. And you could argue that's kind of a bad system, right? One of the famous things I think I mentioned earlier is when car manufacturing, obviously the Ford example is an interesting one. You know, when Toyota comes and starts establishing factories in the United States in the 60s and 70s, or maybe a little later, 70s and 80s really, I guess. You know, they'd introduce methods where, in fact, people on the shop floor can make recommendations about how to do stuff better. And in fact, you could argue it's not Ford that even has interchangeable manufacturing. It's not until Japanese manufacturing comes to the States in the 80s that you could just run a car at full speed the moment you buy it. You know, and I remember back in the 70s, getting a car, you had to drive it slowly at first so the parts could wear in. So, I mean, it's not a simple thing that mass production has to be hierarchical like that. In practice, most of the time it is. Maybe one more question? Anyone? Yeah, please.
At the time when the U.S. was investing so heavily in gun production, where was its money coming from? So how, at that time, where was U.S. getting?
Yeah. Most of American federal revenue in that point does come from tariffs. And that was definitely part of the funding mechanism. They're not funding a lot else, though. You know, you're putting all your eggs in that basket. The federal government in the United States does not get in the business of funding scientific research, with one exception during World War I, until after World War II and after. So this is like a rare thing that they're willing to fund money into, is the creation of a military. And yeah, so that's the source of the revenue in those days, and that's one of the very few things they fund. The only other possible exception is agricultural research later in the 20th century. But this idea that we have of a research, you know, world in which the federal government funds science and technology, it's been very successful, I might add, but it is a 80-year-old innovation, basically Cold War era. All right, thanks a lot, everybody. See you on Wednesday. And let me pass this out if you want to look. This is actually, so I got these are the plans of the gun lot that they're making in France. And the actual diagram got stolen. So the guy who, photo guy who photocopied gave me a photocopy, so you get to come look. They're very cool. They're, I mean, again, history of the banal, history of the ordinary. Here you go. They're like incredibly detailed. And you can see they've got all the tolerances written in, and they're all geographically.
Thanks for listening to this week's Lectures in History podcast. To find more of our history programming, visit our website at c-span.org.